mic is now on.
Terry?
Good morning, Creative Commons. I'm Molly Van Helling, Chair of the Board of Directors of the Creative Commons organization, and it is my great honor to introduce today's keynote speaker. Ruth Okediji is the Jeremiah Smith Jr. Professor of Law at Harvard Law School, where she is also a co-director of the Berkman Klein Center. She's one of the world's foremost authorities on the role of intellectual property in social and economic development. And among her many other leadership roles, she served as the lead negotiator for the Nigerian delegation for the Marrakesh Treaty, about which I think we'll hear more in her remarks today. She is now also one of our newest members of the Board of Directors of Creative Commons, for which we are very grateful for her expertise and leadership. So please join me in welcoming Ruth Okediji.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you to Molly for the gracious introduction, and also thank you to Ryan. I'm not sure where Ryan is, but somewhere, and Mary and all of the CC staff for the great work that they've done in putting this summit together. This is actually my first summit, and I'm really glad to be here. So I don't know if the slides are up. I'm not sure why it's showing. I may need some help here. It's showing lack of harmonization, but I think that's the fifth slide. Terry, I might need some help setting this up. I'm not quite sure what's going on with it. Yeah, it's not responding to any of my... great, thanks. Thank you. It's not responding to, it's not starting from the beginning. Is there something? I can talk without slides, but that would just take much longer. It's kind of stuck on that one, it looks like. So while she's working on that, I'm going to begin so that we can keep on what we have as a really tight schedule. I think it's no surprise to anyone to say that the international copyright system, and in fact copyright itself, I think is in crisis. There are a number of points that we could reflect on, changing technology, a lot of resistance to old business models, the risks that are associated with new business models, particularly in the area of privacy. But I would say that, in my mind, the most significant place of challenge is that the system simply doesn't do what it was created to do. And in particular, when you look at countries in the global south, you do not see the justifications that we have for copyright incentivizing authors. You don't see the limitations and exceptions for copyright facilitating access or use. And to the contrary, what we've seen is a copyright model, particularly in the global south, that because of its rigidity and because of the lack of maturity, lack of sophistication of many institutions, the inability to really facilitate access to cultural goods. That has raised what in my mind I view as a crisis of legitimacy. But there's a great gap between what we see on the texts of the Berne Convention and other international copyright treaties, and what we see in practice on the ground in countries around the world, including in the United States, but for, of course, the fair use standard, which has become, in many ways, the lead doctrine in ensuring that there is some capacity to argue that property rights in cultural goods cannot be absolute, that there is a reason for copyright that is beyond remuneration, that access to cultural goods is a right that everyone should and must have, and that the capacity from education all the way to entertainment, the capacity to actually continue to create, is dependent on a robust public domain. Now, there are lots and lots of challenges, I think, in the system, but in particular, the challenge of creating global norms that constrain the policy space in which countries are able to think about and actually implement rational copyright policy and rational copyright statutes is increasingly challenged in Geneva, and of course the fairly significant limitations that are imposed by this thing called the three-step test that we saw in the TRIPS agreement has become somewhat of a challenge for developing countries who, as I said earlier, lack both the institutional maturity and oftentimes the legal culture to facilitate access to cultural goods. So I probably have about 3 main points that I want to make to you this morning. Number one, my view of the multilateral copyright system as a source of facilitating access to global culture is that that system in itself is a problem, and it's a problem that must be taken seriously. For every single limitation and exception, every doctrine that is intended to facilitate access to goods and access to knowledge, there is this reference to the Berne Convention, a reference to the TRIPS agreement, and a reference to the limited capacity of sovereign nations to, in fact, negotiate around with any kind of certainty what kinds of limitations and exceptions are going to be viewed as consistent with the three-step test. Now, for those of you who have looked at the Marrakesh Treaty, who have in particular studied it closely, you will find that there are many, many iterations of the three-step test precisely because there was such an insistence on the ground, on the part of publishers, that that test must feature significantly in the text of the treaty. But even outside of Marrakesh, every time there is a debate, every time there's a question about a new use, every time there's a debate about how to adapt copyright in a way that seems to match much more consistently with the interest of the public and with the interest of owners, there is this omnibus sort of presence, this hanging cloud in every legislature that I have spoken to about what can we really do in face of what the Berne Convention requires us to do. My response has always been, well, the Berne Convention is what you make it. Because the responsibility for culture, the responsibility for education, the responsibility for designing copyright law to actually meet the needs and the interests and the rights of every person rests not in Geneva, but in the capital cities, and in particular in the hands of those of you who are here today, people who are concerned about agitating and advocating for freedom to access cultural goods. And so my first point, I guess, of the morning is to say that the multilateral system is in decline. And it's not in decline because the United States is pulling back or because there has been, in fact, some question about the political leadership in the US today and its commitment to multilateralism. Those concerns are there. But I think that in the area of copyright law, multilateralism has been pulling back on the decline for quite some time. Why? Well, it takes a long time to negotiate a treaty. It takes a very long time to negotiate a treaty. And doing so in conditions in which the technology is rapidly changing, doing so in a season in which business models are more able to adapt to the interests and demands of the public, doing so at a time when the capacity for access is far greater than it's ever been, and yet the effort to lock up cultural goods is also quite significant. It seems to me that doing so in Geneva is precisely the wrong place to do. It's precisely the wrong place to work. And Geneva is no less insulated from the moneyed interests, from the vested business models, from the claims and the demands of industry than any other capital city around the world. And so the battles that are fought in Geneva are really in many ways mirroring the battles that are being fought every day, everywhere, in all countries. And so to me, to think that the answer is multilateralism, I think is a mistake. Nonetheless, the multilateral process is going to continue. It will continue because for every time there is a new treaty, there are 3 or 4 in the making already. And those 3 or 4 are not going to alter, just like the Marrakesh Treaty did not alter some of the foundational assumptions that are embedded into the international copyright system. And those foundational assumptions are that without strong property rights, without absolute property rights, without tampering down on limitations and exceptions, that we're not going to see creativity, we're not going to see innovation at the pace and at the levels that it ought to be. But all of you sitting in this room know that that is not the case. That spontaneous, unintentional, unincentivized, unrewarded many times creativity is always going to be part and parcel of the cultures in which we all live and in which we all participate. And that in fact, the raw materials and the possibilities of creating new works, of sharing new works, of making sure every person has access to what they need to become productive citizens relies not on the rights that we give to authors, but on the rights that we also give to the public. That every author is a member of the public, and every member of the public eventually becomes an author himself or herself. And so that virtuous circle becomes a really significant part of copyright policy, but it is not a part of what we see in the international copyright space. That for many of you, you know, of course, that the model that we see in global copyright relations is a model in which the so-called minimum rights, they're actually quite robust, are accompanied by virtually no commitment to limitations and exceptions. And the first extraordinary departure from that century-plus-old model is the Marrakesh Treaty. Now, I had some wonderful pictures for you of the negotiators, but I do need to say that the Marrakesh Treaty did not happen overnight. For those of you who were involved in it, the Marrakesh Treaty did not even happen in a decade. But one of the things that I think is important in conjunction with the idea that multilateralism is probably not the place that we want to hinge our greatest hopes for a more open internet, a more open culture of access to knowledge, the Marrakesh Treaty began at the national level. It began with legislators in a much more innocent world of copyright. State legislators saying it's important for people who have disabilities to have the same rights of access to cultural goods as people who are sighted. In other words, this was not really a copyright debate. This was not a debate about rights and limitations. It was a debate about access. It was a debate about should ordinary citizens that have impairments that would otherwise make it impossible or difficult for them to access cultural goods, should those citizens be able to enjoy and participate and contribute to culture like everyone else? It was a debate about equality. And when we think about rights of access, I know that so often we want to think about rights of access as though it was, really about this thing called copyright, that really about this thing about business models, but really it's not. Fundamentally, what we want to see and what we saw in this innocent season of copyright policy making and copyright norm setting in the global setting, in the global arena, was really an effort to think about how best to get creative works, how best to get cultural goods into the hands of everyone. The reason we started with the Berne Convention, the reason the debate began was to facilitate this thing called cross-border exchange of goods, cross-border exchange of cultural works, cross-border exchange of those things that were created. Authors, as Jessica Littman, my good friend, would say, want to be read. Writers write to a public that wants to hear what they have to say. Cultural goods are not treasure troves that are locked up in tombs only for the sacred few to have access. And so when we began the discussion many, many years ago about the possibility of unifying access to goods for visually impaired persons, it picked up on historical antecedents. It picked up on this idea that copyright was meant to allow the cross-border exchange of goods, was meant to encourage and not discourage writers who want to be read, who want their works to be read, to ensure that they had a means by which they could do so and by which we could have cross-cultural exchanges of culture. And so for copyright today to become this thing of control by the select few to decide what terms of access the many others can participate in culture is quite troubling to anyone who cares about historical integrity and to anyone who cares about the underlying foundations of the copyright system. And it's important because when the fights in Geneva occur and when there are proposals for new treaties, the idea that this is a treaty that only talks about protection, that only talks about rights and not about limitations and not about how you actually encourage the emergence of a participatory culture, the emergence of new generations of authors and writers, the idea that that conversation doesn't happen in Geneva at all should be deeply troubling for all of us. And so at the national level, states had already recognized that it was important for visually impaired persons to have access to copyrighted works. And so there was a clear exception in many countries for visually impaired persons to be able to reproduce, to be able to distribute, to be able to use protected works. But not every country had a copyright treaty. Now, the story is often told that part of the impetus for the Marrakesh Treaty was this idea that not every country had the exception, and that countries that did have the exception had them designed and sort of characterized in different ways. And so it was an uneven exception. But in fact, for many countries, the exception for visually impaired persons actually predated many of the restrictions and many of the rights that were granted to authors in the Berne Convention and that member states of the Berne Convention had to incorporate in their own national laws. There was, in fact, many countries who already recognized that there were cultural exceptions, and those cultural exceptions varied across time and across space. And so some would argue that the limits and the exceptions that were created in the Berne Convention that predated many of the rights that were ultimately granted to authors in the treaty suggests that prior to this new sort of bizarre model in which all we thought about were absolute rights with no exceptions, that prior to that, states had reserved some sovereign policy space in order to ensure that they had the capacity to adapt the copyright system to the needs and to the demands of the day. When the discussions for Marrakesh began, the Africa Group tabled a proposal, the EU tabled a proposal, the United States tabled a proposal, Latin American countries tabled a proposal in conjunction with the World Blind Union. And if you were to study these proposals, they're striking for a number of things. First, the Africa Group proposal did not want to see a distinction between the rights of the visually impaired persons and rights of museums, archives, libraries, educational institutions. The idea was, what we need is a comprehensive treaty that sets forth limitations and exceptions, not only for visually impaired persons, but also for cultural institutions. And the idea was that we need this kind of a treaty to counterbalance the model in which treaties only grant rights and don't recognize the rights of the public. But back to my theme about multilateralism being a problem, I think that one of the things that we will see is that making fat copyright treaties is no longer going to be a feature of the copyright regime, that rights treaties are going to face the same or similar kinds of questions that we face in the negotiations and in the lead up to the Marrakesh Treaty. And the question being, in what way will these treaties usurp, uproot, upend established interests? We're seeing it on the right side, we're seeing it on the limitations and exceptions side. And so again, I think that the idea that we're going to resolve these issues in Geneva, in an institution in which its roots are dedicated to a particular vision in which the only way it views creativity is through rights and through private rights of individuals. And mind you, not only private rights of individuals, but private rights of individuals who have a particular view of what it means to actually create a certain kind of copyrighted work. I mean, there is a reason you do not see oral literature as part of the copyright regime. There's a reason you don't see traditional knowledge as part of the copyright regime. There's a reason you do not see reliance on copyright as the primary way in which creativity is engaged in and shared in many countries in the global south, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. There is a reason. And so the idea that, again, negotiating in this preset set of constraints, in this preset culture where you're granting rights and almost like crumbs after you eat toast, you're giving limitations and exceptions, is not the way I think we're going to see a robust culture emerge in which all citizens are able to participate equally, not only in creating from the raw materials available in the public domain, but also in sharing the works that have been created by others. Number two feature, I think, of the international copyright regime, and in reference to what has happened with Marrakesh, is that we're going to continue to see parallels between the kinds of rights that are emerging right now at the World Intellectual Property Organization. There is a broadcasting treaty that is being negotiated. There is the possibility of a treaty for libraries, for educational institutions, for archives that has been languishing there. There are, of course, for those of you who've been following it, negotiations involving traditional knowledge. We're seeing clearly that in the next 5 to 10 years, the efforts to advance some kind of vision for global copyright relations is an effort that is still stymied in the battle over what copyright is and what copyright should be for. And clarifying that vision, I think, is really critical, particularly in the new kind of possibilities that technology affords us to be able actually to share across borders. That the capacity to do something that we do in Creative Commons, the capacity to advocate and really encourage a sharing culture, is something that must go on because the rights culture will go on. And last, I think it's very important for there to be a shift in the debate. That the shift needs to be from individual rights to really thinking about rights for institutions like libraries, like archives, like museums. Institutions that I refer to as the stewards or the custodians of culture. Because you see, we tend to think of culture as something that is only what we're doing now and today. But in fact, access to the cultures of the past remain quite vital for the kinds of educated citizens that we are trying to ensure have the opportunity to emerge and to mature in the world in which we live today. And I think the idea that we do not have rights to permit the cross-border exchange of books between libraries around the world, the fact that libraries can be sued for copyright infringement, and of course in countries like the US where there are statutory damages, the idea that there is a strict liability even when you engage in the work that libraries were created to engage in should be something that all of us are concerned about. I've been, in reflecting on the Marrakesh Treaty, been saying we won a fairly significant battle. As Justin Hughes, who was the US negotiator, said it, if the Marrakesh Treaty works, we would have done a really great thing. But the battle at the national level, just exactly a month ago today, the US implementation bill was submitted to Senate. We've seen implementation in Australia, in Canada, and many of the provisions that were such a battle to get into the treaty have been scaled back at the national implementation level. The idea that if blind people can afford to pay for the work, if there's a commercially available copy in the market, then the rights in the treaty don't really avail as easily. We're seeing some countries embrace that, despite in the treaty provisions to ensure that there are opportunities for visually impaired persons to access the work beyond just being defined as visually impaired, but other kinds of disabilities. We're seeing some countries cut back on that. So even when you win the battle multilaterally, the capital cities, the countries, the institutions, the political processes in which implementation occurs remain a vital battleground. And I think it becomes vitally important as we think about the making of international copyright treaties and even, frankly, the making of national copyright laws. It becomes vitally important to have as parallel what I call the informal copyright reform process. The informal copyright reform process, informed by Creative Commons licenses, informed by the understanding that a robust public domain is good for everyone, informed by the idea that copyright at its heart is not about a right to copy or a right to withhold others from copying. That at its very heart, copyright is about a means of institutionalizing this thing that we call culture and this thing that we call knowledge and this thing that we call access. One of the great things in the Marrakesh Treaty that I think is often overlooked is that for the first time, it embodies both an underlying principle of fair use or fair dealing as a means of implementing the treaty. It also recognizes what I call co-fair use. For many physically impaired persons who are unable to actually do the things that the treaty allows, it allows those who are caretakers of persons with disabilities to engage in those acts. So co-fair use is embedded in the treaty to begin to make copyright law look like the world that we want to live in, look like a world in which people are not only authorized but enabled to do the things that are critical for them to become important members of our culture and of our society. So I think in my closing remark, what I would like to say is that we're moving, I think, from the Berne Convention to a system in which I think the commons, the idea that we can have both and we can have them function in ways that are better, has an opportunity to breathe. And the Marrakesh Treaty and the negotiation of that treaty suggests that this is possible. But for it to move from possibility to reality, there is a significant amount of work to be done. And that work has to be done by those of you in this room. That work has to be done by those of you who are advocating for sensible reform, those of you who are fighting for the digital environment that we live in, not to mimic the printed environment that we're trying to escape, for the tools to be developed that actually empower individual users and institutional stewards to make this thing called access to knowledge not only a movement, but a reality that informs the way in which citizens are produced for today and for the generations to come. Thank you.
Hi everybody, thank you Ruth. That was a very inspiring call to arms and telling us how it is in the battlefield of copyright law reform, both at WIPO and also domestically around the world. And as I confirm, a lot of us in the room here are working very actively in copyright law reform. So I want to introduce the other panelists. I'm Delia Brown. from Australia. I'm the National Copyright Director for the school and TAFE sector, and have been involved in copyright law reform in Australia for decades. And it just seems to be Groundhog Day. It seems to be a review and a constant battle every year. Michael Geist, who's a very well-known IP law professor, who's also been one of the sort of leading voices on user rights and copyright law reform in Canada, and who I've been following and working with over the last few years as well. Teresa Nobre, who's from Portugal, also from CC Portugal, but also very, very active member of Communia, and she is one of the people in Communia who is leading the current kind of advocacy in the EU, particularly with an amazing campaign which is fixing copyright for education. And so I really encourage you to also follow Communia's work in this realm. And all of us at some stage have been in Geneva trying to sort of deal with the push for limitations and exceptions. And so what I was just going to ask as a first question, because we are sort of, CC has a presence in Geneva as one of the civil society groups, and has also been quite actively supporting the push in particular for a treaty for limitations and exceptions. And there are people in this room here who are working on trying to get that up and running, a treaty for limitations and exceptions for education. Libraries and Archives, of course, has been there for some time. So, you know, is there still some value for us actually participating at Geneva?
You know, I think so. I strongly believe that you cannot be absent from the table when the conversations are happening. I don't think that you win at each stage just by showing up at the end, right? That there's a lead up to any victory that you have, and there's a lead up, frankly, to any loss. And for those of you who were at Larry's keynote yesterday, I strongly believe and agree with a comment, one of the comments that he made, and that is, not every battle is for winning. I can't tell you how many times in the lead up to Marrakesh we did not think that this was going to happen. In fact, to be quite honest, Jamie Love had invited me for a meeting 10 years before the Marrakesh negotiations began. And I remember getting this call from him saying, you know, I'm organizing a workshop to think about a treaty for mandatory limitation and exception. And this is the thing I think most of us overlook also about Marrakesh. It's a mandatory exception. It is the first of its kind. And when Jamie called me a decade earlier and said, we're doing this workshop, I literally burst out laughing. I just laughed. And I said, I like you. I will be there. And I showed up 5 minutes before the workshop and left 5 minutes afterwards. I was not going to invest in this at all. Famous last words. And so there was someone who had a vision, and there were people who had tenacity. And I think you need both. I think you need both. And so I absolutely think that you have to be in Geneva, because those conversations will go on.
Of course. Michael, do you want to just tell us a little bit what's been happening in Canada at the moment, because you're going through another situation of review, and I've been noticing you did a blog post just today or yesterday, which is talking about some attitudes for some in the government about public interest and copyright.
I did. Thanks, Delia. Actually, let me link it a little bit to what Ruth had to say, and start by saying that talk was awesome. And thank you for not just the eloquence, but the effectiveness and the amazing contribution. You started by, you made a comment that really resonated about burn being what you make it. And I think that actually reflects a little bit where Canada has been at, because for those that don't know, we actually, I think, represent one of the places where we did have a long fight, and I think we did, by and large, win. As you may know, our Supreme Court of Canada has characterized so-called limitations and exceptions like fair dealing as a user's right. And the way it's interpreted that over the last 10 to 15 years has been to make very clear that there needs to be a balance in copyright, and it is a balance of one between creator rights on the one hand and users' rights, and that both need to be interpreted in a robust manner. And when a court does more than just provide lip service to that sort of thing, what you end up with is the kinds of decisions that we have had, which have tried to imbue the law with technological neutrality. It sought to ensure that fair dealing truly is a user's right that gets interpreted in a broad and liberal manner. Our government has also underwent a long process of reform that culminated in 2012. Actually, the main court decisions came within about 2 weeks of the law passing. And we got various provisions, including protection for non-commercial user-generated content. We got a cap and limitation on statutory damages in non-commercial situations. We got an expansion of fair dealing. And what we also got, and we get still today, it just happened a number of weeks ago, are claims that somehow what we're doing violates the Berne Convention. We are about to enter into another phase of copyright review. In fact, on Tuesday, the first hearing will take place in Ottawa, and it will be education groups that will start. But we will hear from publishers and copyright collectives, and down the road towards November, December, hear from academics and other sorts of organizations. But as part of that process, one of the core arguments will be Canada is doing it wrong. And one of the arguments will be that somehow we're violating our international obligations in doing so. I don't think that's right, but I think it can be, if we're not vigilant around these issues, a powerful tool that gets used amongst politicians in particular that don't know any better. Very quickly, the last issue, or the other element that ties in this blog post that is a concern, is that when you refight these battles again and again and again, and many in the room, as I look out, have been doing this for a long time, you begin to see the same kinds of arguments recur. And one of the things that we are likely to see is that an internal battle in Canada between so-called industry department, now called Innovation, Science and Economic Development, which has tended to have been more receptive to some of the kinds of concerns that people here have, as against Canadian heritage. Ironically enough, a department devoted to culture and heritage, which has tended to side far more with rights holder interests, and indeed, in crafting the instructions for this committee's review, I was able to obtain under an access to information request early drafts in which the advice coming from the department was that we needed to do away with the notions of balance, that balance had caused more problems than they had solved, and that let's use this as an opportunity to move past that. Now, thankfully, the ultimate letter did not include that language. The industry department would have apparently pushed back, and so we don't find it in the letter. In fact, we don't find the word balance at all. There is such a stalemate within government that in a 4-page letter, they couldn't use the word balance because the two departments have different views about what that ultimately means. But it certainly highlights how essential it will be for all Canadians, indeed many others, to get engaged in the process as it unfolds over the next year here in Canada.
That's a very good point. And Teresa, I'm going to jump into you now because you've been involved in trying to do some advocacy in the EU through Communia. And of course, talking about multilateral treaties, you've got the EU directive that makes it even more difficult than the Berne Convention. Do you want to tell us something about the experiences you've been sort of been challenged with over the last kind of 12 months?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Delia. We are right now dealing with this new copyright reform, the first in 10 years, which has some so-so things, one good thing and the rest super bad things. And one of the problems in this discussion is like you are always put in a position where you have to react, and we have really little space to try to create positive changes. So we have to deal with a new publisher right, we have to deal with filters of content, and all of that occupies a lot of space of discussion. So when you want to talk about positive things like educational exception, there's really little attention being paid to that. And that's a problem because, of course, we have now, for instance, a proposal for a mandatory educational exception, which is good in number one, but it's super bad in number two because that exception can be overridden by licenses. So that's an issue. You know, you can't really be very complex and enter into deep discussions. We in Europe still don't have an understanding of exceptions and limitations as users' rights. So when you are given something, but you are not really given something that it's well protected against contractual overrides or TPM or other types of legal instruments that could take all of the benefit that the exception gives you. So, yeah, so it has been really difficult in Europe to try to create something positive, as in the sense of trying to make this understanding that, you know, users have rights, and these rights have to be protected. So you won't give. It's not good to give us an exception and right away take that exception back by giving priority to licenses or by not protecting that exception against contractual overrides and not protecting that exception against TPMs and etc. And then, you know, we have been in Europe, and we know that Europe has a huge role at WIPO. So we are also trying to do some work at WIPO, and we understand that that's also super difficult, and it involves a lot of effort and time and preparation and bringing evidence. And so we want to embrace that path too, and the WIPO international discussions. We understand it's not going to be easy, but I think there's some space, and if I can say something, I think there's some space for the Creative Commons community, which has the knowledge and the expertise and is connected, and to come there and also bring their voices to the WIPO discussions.
Delia, may I say something?
Yes.
So two things that I just want to say, because I think what both Michael and Teresa are describing are so important. First, I think that it's a mistake for us every time there's a proposal for a new treaty for the only response to be, we need balance or we need exceptions and limitations. There need to be times where we say no new rights. Now, deciding when those should be and what particular rights are at issue, I think is something to keep an eye on. But I think that the default position of simply requiring balance as a response to ever-growing rights is not the position of principle and value. And so I really want to encourage those of you who are at the front lines of this battle to be clear about when new rights are legitimate and when they are not. To essentially grant a right or an exception and then override it by contracts is a problem. And I think one of the things that the battle both in Canada and in the EU have shown is that you really need to have a coalition of advocates who can both speak to the policies that undergird contracts and licenses and the policies that undergird copyright law. What it is demanding, I think, of this community is greater agility, greater resources in terms of the scope of policy interventions you can make. But frankly, I think that education is vital. I can't tell you how many times I have gone, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where I'm speaking to policymakers, and I ask them how many of them have forwarded an email that they received that morning. You know, and half of the policymakers will raise their hands, and I'll say, well, here's what your copyright infringement damages are that you would need to pay under your own statute. And the look of utter shock. I mean, most policymakers have not read the statute, and if they have, they think of themselves as elites who are insulated from the consequences of their own quote-unquote infringement. And I think one of the things that is critical about CC is this effort to democratize the idea of access and to democratize the notion that only average people are engaged in infringement, and therefore the price of these imbalanced, problematic, often unprincipled efforts to expand rights are borne by the very people who should not be bearing them at all.
I tend to agree, but again, the copyright and contract thing is something that's now under discussion again in Australia, and thank goodness for the Australian Law Reform Commission review recommendations that also recommended, you know, getting rid of our many old-fashioned exceptions and replacing it with a flexible fair use type of exception. It also recommended that we should look at making sure that contract cannot override exceptions. So that's going to be something discussed this year in Australia. So I think those sort of things are very important. I mean, when you talk about education, you're talking about educating politicians and policymakers. And how would you be recommending people who are in sort of emerging countries where they're dealing with copyright law reform, the best way for them to do that?
I think that there are two things. I'm talking about educating politicians, but I'm also talking about education in the very kind of classic sense. My sense is that educational institutions and educators are going to be a critical part of the coalitions that you build. There is nothing more effective. Jonathan Band is here. I think Sean Flynn. I've seen several of you in the room that I've encountered across the world in different fora. Educational institutions have come late to the game, and that is part of why the battle is so particularly fierce, because an educational institution, in many ways, probably much more than museums, but more similar to libraries, have not only huge audiences through which the miseducation about copyright can be corrected, but the capacity to even make materials available in the classroom. Every teacher feels that in really particular ways. And I think almost every government around the world talks about education as the one thing that they want to get right. So it's a really strategic but also vitally important platform when it comes to reform. And it's ironic to me that we would say educational institutions need to have permission to do the job that they exist to do. I was sharing, I think in Australia, when I was giving a talk at the Australian Digital Alliance Forum, that I was asked to pay $30 a page to get copies of my own article for my students to read. I was infuriated. Fortunately, I had a file that I just gave to the library, and I said, Section 108, just go to the library and make copies of it. But the fact that most educators, particularly in other parts of the world, including in Europe, have to figure out how to get a license, the transaction costs for doing that, most students are actually living in the shadows of copyright. They're learning in the shadows of copyright. And I find this significantly problematic. And so this is an area where, for educational exceptions, I think the open educational resources move is really vital. But I still think that we have to empower our institutions, qua institutions, that it shouldn't just be the students who have their rights of fair use and privacy, but that educational institutions need to have the ability to make sure that materials are available to students and that they're available to students in the best manner. The India High Court decision from 2 years ago, I think in many ways leads the way, but I find it striking that many of these countries that are relying on limitations and exceptions are not doing it from just copyright law. Right? The India High Court was referring to the Indian Constitution and the fundamental right to education, and you're seeing what I think is good for us, and that is the notion that these are not battles about two private individuals fighting over property, that these are battles about governance, and they're battles about creating citizens that are empowered to do the things that we want citizens to do, and that is to engage in the political process, engage in the cultural process, engage in markets for ideas. And the idea that we're just going to lock information up so that people have no access to ideas and can't read what other people have to say and speak and contribute and remix. The idea that that's even plausible is shocking to me.
So it's really interesting you say that education has come late to the party, because there is a reason for that. And the reason for that, to explain to the room, is that schools are basically normally run by departments of education, and governments don't generally or departments don't generally lobby other government departments for change. And the reason why I think both Canada and Australia have been very effective in the education sector coming together, so the university sector, the school sector, the vet sector, are all in as one voice working together seeking change. And in Canada, it was kind of really led maybe by the Canadian Minister of Educational Council, but what we were reacting towards actually was mandated, well, remuneration schemes, collective licensing arrangements. So because of the way that the collective licensing arrangements happen in Australia, which are compulsory, we've got this ridiculous situation where the schools, which is 3.5 million school children, we've got about 10,000 schools in Australia, and we're paying Copyright Agency around $65 million to use small bits of stuff in the classroom for literary, artistic, musical, and dramatic works. Now, a significant portion of what we're paying for is freely available public internet material. So it's stuff that says free when you actually, download it or email it or whatever on a website. But because of the statutory license scheme, everything's in. Everything's in there. There's no fair dealing for education or a fair use exception for education. It's for research and study, and that is kind of the problem. So when I started my job in 2005, we started doing this electronic use scheme, I was going, this is absolute madness. Under this collecting society sample survey, 95% of what we're copying is freely available on the internet. Mm-hmm. It's not actually, we're not impacting the copyright owner's market. There is no market, but a market's being developed because of this license, which is kind of crazy. So we have come late to the party in the sense that at WIPO there's very few civil society groups that are representing education interests, and that's because the governments look after, everyone's kids go to school, so to speak. So it's been very, very good to see that there's been more advocacy for educational limitation exceptions, which has been assisted by Creative Commons, but also by Communia and also by our friends in the Library and Archives. But it is a difficult area where it is actually a government thing, so that's why you don't see so many NGOs.
Can I say something about educating policymakers or involving the educational community? So what we have been doing at Communia, we are trying to create evidence that you do need an educational exception and mandatory that's harmonized and applied the same way everywhere in Europe. And we understand that policymakers don't really understand the impact of what we are saying. So one of the things that we did, and afterwards was also used by other countries, was very simple education, daily scenarios, presenting daily scenarios. We create these graphics where we analyze very simple scenarios such as, can a teacher show a YouTube video in class? A freely available YouTube video in class. And seeing all the no's or all the yeses, yes, if you pay so, it does have an impact. So that's one of the things that we try to do, trying to create materials that are easily understandable by policymakers, but also by teachers, so and educational institutions, because they also don't understand immediately the impact of educational exceptions. And the other thing that we have been doing in Communia, which I think is like a slow thing that is starting to have some impact, is creating a network of educational institutions that can really bring their voice to Brussels, because one thing is having us as civil society advocating for education, and another thing is, of course, having educators advocating for education. So we were able to bring some organizations, including, for instance, the unions, the teachers' unions, and that really has an impact. And I think that's something that if we are to advise good tools and ideas how to bring this forward, is try to create a network in your own country or in your own region of advocates that are really the ones concerned about the issue.
Michael.
Sure. So I was just jump in with this notion that teachers were and education was late to the party, and I have to say that teachers want to teach. And students want to spend time in the classroom and study and work with their fellow students. If you're a copyright collective, you don't have a job other than trying to enforce your rights. And so in the Canadian context, there is not a politician, there is not a policymaker, certainly anywhere in Ottawa, and I would venture to say in many provinces as well, that has not heard week after week, month after month, from copyright collectives and publishers and others since the 2012 reforms, saying this is the damage that this has caused, they allege, and they're wrong, but this is what they claim. And so as we enter into this process in 2017, there has been a single side of the discussion. Teachers want to teach. Educators don't want to spend their time lobbying in Ottawa again and again and again on issues that they thought were addressed and solved by the Supreme Court of Canada and then by policymakers. What it means is that we don't spend our time doing it, and I don't think we should be spending our time doing it if our priority is education. But what becomes essential is that when there is this opportunity again, we can't take a pass. And so I do think that we have to do what our real jobs are, but when the policies are again in play, or when, as we saw in Canada over the last couple of months, we get certain groups calling for website blocking without any sort of court oversight to really change the way we can access the internet in Canada, it becomes incumbent, certainly on education, but I think it becomes incumbent upon so many of the groups that are focused on access to culture and access to education and a free and open internet to ensure that their voices are heard.
I'm going to just say two things about fair use, because I think it's important for this audience to hear this. Jonathan, I think, is probably at the forefront of studying what's happening with fair use around the world. But I would just want to say that for countries that are undergoing reform and thinking about fair use, it's vitally important that you watch over what kind of fair use is being implemented. In some proposals that I've seen recently, particularly on the African continent, what looks like fair use is in fact a license. And what is called fair use sometimes is really a hybrid, which is not bad, of fair use and fair dealing. But what is happening is that if you focus, and this is part of why I said you have to be at the conversations in Geneva, what I call the mutation of fair use around the world is going to come back to begin to create problems, I think, for this idea of an adaptable, flexible, open-ended judicial ability to carve exceptions and limitations and uses in a way that's necessary for the current environment. And so in Kenya, in South Africa, in Nigeria, we're seeing these fair use bills or these reform bills that are looking very different than what you would anticipate fair use really is. So that's something that I want to say, that fair use needs to be safeguarded, and it needs to be done in a context in which you have networks so that you can figure out exactly what makes sense for those national reforms. The last comment that I wanted to make really has to do with what I think is on the horizon, both in terms of the work of Creative Commons, and that is the coordination with industry is seamless. I mean, industry has been doing this for a long time. And so all it takes is a threat in, Cape Town for someone in DC to have a call to someone in, wherever, and the soldiers are on the move. And there's going to be a need for vigilance, diligence, and to be ready. This is not advocacy by sloppiness. You have to know exactly what the stakes are. There's got to be a clear vision, and you need to understand when the battle is vital and which ones you can walk away from. But the ability to deepen networks is vital, I think, in the Creative Commons community, and networks not only internally but with similar-minded movements, organizations, platforms concerned about ensuring that we have an open and robust access to culture.
Absolutely agree. And we have been starting to do that within the movement, within Creative Commons, working together. And this afternoon at 2 o'clock, there's going to be a session on sort of the global update from many people in the CC community who are working on law reform in their country. So I recommend that you come down to that. I also think that there's been an email that's been sent out to the CC affiliates, maybe Tim, which is asking members of our community who, if there's any copyright law reform going on in their country and if they're involved in it, because we're going to start sort of organising ourselves a little bit more robustly so we can fight this huge battle. But there's a lot of amazing experts in the room, and so we have an amazing shared intelligence, and we're really, really smart. So although there's a lot of money and really the fear and uncertainty and doubt campaign that's been done by the rights holders and collective signers is despicable. But we have an opportunity to work really, really well together and actually probably advocate for some really great change. But it does take 10 to 20 years, guys. I'm hoping I'm going to get fair use in Australia before I retire. I really would like to thank Ruth for your very inspiring talk this morning, and also Michael and Teresa for sharing what's been happening on the battlegrounds and their arenas, and thanks very much.
Ruth, thank you